Hello, everyone, and I hope everyone is doing well under these unexpected, maybe, or dramatic circumstances. I hope you're all safe, and I hope as you're staying home, you can enjoy our online presentation. And it's interesting that the topic today is about the 12th house and demystifying the 12th house, given that we are in a very 12th house situation. I would like to thank Linda for her invitation. And I will be speaking about the different aspects of the 12th house, and I will also relate that to the influence of Neptune being a natural ruler of Pisces, the modern ruler, and immediately associated with the 12th house thematically. So I will start talking and describing the different themes and applications, understanding this from an evolutionary point of view. We will have time for questions, I assume. I usually, when I get talking, it's hard to stop me, but I will do my best to allow some questions just so people can make good use of this material. So briefly, if you are interested, let me see, make sure to check the book I wrote on Neptune and the 12th house. A lot of this material is taken from there. So if there's anything you're missing and in an hour, there's just only a certain amount of material we can cover, you can of course check the book. I also have a course if you are interested going deeper into this material. And quickly, we're also having an online event coming up on April 23, Bridging Science and Spirituality. So this consists of 12 tracks that you choose and then many short presentations. And so looking at the 12th house, diving into our subject matter, what's important is always to understand something in astrology related to its natural order. So we see that the 12th house associated with Pisces and Neptune is also naturally opposing the 6th house and the sign of Virgo. Mercury, natural square to Gemini and Sagittarius. And the 12th house precedes the first house. So it is the last house of the zodiac. It's also the house that is before the first. Now, when we speak about the first house, and we look at this sphere, at the circle, we ask ourselves, why do we start there? Why in a circle do we actually find a particular starting point? We could start the wheel anywhere. Obviously, Aries and the first house are the eastern horizon. That's where the sun rises. Every star, every planet rises on the eastern side of the planet. However, if you pay attention, they rise in the 12th house. They don't rise in the first house. So anything that's in the first house is actually not visible. It's under the earth. And so that's an interesting and important point. If we look at the ascendant point, there are two directions. There's one direction that goes from 12 to 11 to 10 to 9, etc. And the other direction goes from 1 to 2 to 3, etc. So the wheel, and if we understand that each sign and each house represent an evolutionary step or a developmental step in our life, whether it's babyhood to infancy to adolescence and so forth, or whether it's a change of consciousness. It's important to basically realize it's bi-directional. We also know the nodes move retrograde, so they also move from Pisces to Aquarius to Capricorn, and it's an important thing to keep in mind. So when I speak of the 12th house, interestingly, I see it as both the end of a process and the very beginning before the launch of a new process. If we realize the first house is where the ignition happens, it's where the birthing happens. You know, it's a Mars and Aries house, so it has to do with separation, individuation, the need to be me, to become, and to push away from the mother's womb. You know, the very act of separation from Mars, and it's a baby pushing out in order to become an independent being. And we know that the fire principle represents that independent spirit and the need to find how we as individuals can participate, create, exist. So when I speak of that birthing process, anything that's on the ascendant and into the first house represents that impulse to become, which would mean that that sign is in a way represents our new cycle. It represents what this incarnation is about, in the sense that it represents what we're birthing in this life. So if I have Virgo rising, you know, this life is about healing. This life is going to be about, excuse me, solving problems, you know, analyzing my life so I can take charge and fix and develop and improve. And then if I have Gemini rising, then this life is about education. It's about increasing my understanding of life, of knowledge in general, and moving away from the status quo. You know, the Gemini has limbs and it needs to walk and travel places and explore and find things out. So whatever's in the first house represents, you know, that impulse, how I'm driving myself to become. And then it continues. From the second house, I find my resources and what I have available to sustain myself. You know, it's the house of self-sustainability. Third house is where I, you know, figure things out, learn about life. And so I gather, you know, all these all these resources, the mental, the physical, and family support. And then in the fifth house, I'm ready to deliver. I'm ready to start producing. So from 1 to 4, I'm in the process of accumulation, of finding my bearings and grounding myself. Then in the fifth, I'm beginning to deliver, to create. And, you know, it's the house of children, and it's also where we find our sense of purpose. Then in the sixth house is where I'm really polishing all my skills. You know, that's why Virgos are usually very good at what they do. You know, there's a very strong autonomy and skill set. So from the 1st to the 6th is where we are really fully preparing ourselves. The 6th house is also a house where we have tools to fix our problems, to face crisis and overcome illnesses, or anything that comes our way that we need to take charge of. And that's very important because that 6th house opposes the 12th. So I'm starting on purpose to go through the other houses so we can better understand where we go when we lead to the 12th. So in the 6th house, we reach a certain level of mastery, of perfection. And what is so particular about the 6th house and the sign of Virgo and Mercury, think about Mercury ruling both the 3rd and the 6th house. So in the 3rd and Gemini phase, we learn things. And then in the 6th house, we apply what we learned. So we make practical use of our knowledge. And what is knowledge? Knowledge gives us control. The more we know, the more we can be in control of our lives. The more we can be in control, the safer we are. We can, predict problems. Virgo is the sign of prevention. They're going to have a bottle of water and first aid kit when they go out in nature. They're not leaving things to chance. So it's that sign that uses its expertise and its understanding and experience to manage life. And of course, when there is control, there's also a certain level of autonomy, and like we said, many skills that we develop. Then when we cross the descendant and we move into the 7th house, we realize that it doesn't matter how skilled we are and how well we manage resources. Virgo is and the 6th house is the 2nd earth sign. So it has to do with proper management, sustainability, and work. Now that's a key word that I'm going to use, work. When I speak about work in the 6th house, I don't only mean having a job. I also mean anything in your life that requires work. For example, your relationships. You need to work on them in order to sustain them and improve them. So whatever is in your 6th house is what's in your control and what you can do to improve, to repair, to polish, and to fine tune and really get the best out of it. So it's a house that requires tremendous focus, but it is also, it's a house where we really feel that it's in our hands, that we are the healers, we are in control. And then we move to the 7th house and we realize the lack. That doesn't matter how much we have, we don't have everything. And it begins with men and women. In traditional sense, you need your polarity in order to be able to conceive, to procreate. But it doesn't end only on a biological level. The 7th house relates to anything in your life that you don't feel confident about and that you'd rather have someone else do. That's why you reach out to other people, because in the 7th house, you want help, you want cooperation. And so you become more vulnerable and you are opening yourself up to relationships. I know, as long as you're in the lower hemisphere, from first to sixth house, it's all in your hands and you're autonomous. And, Virgos don't like to delegate. Sixth house, we want to do things our own way. But when we reach the upper hemisphere and we reach the seventh house, that's when we realize that we don't have all the answers and we need other people. Then the eighth house and the Pluto paradigm, where we reach a deep point of exhaustion, where we face our deepest limitations. And so it's another house where we face crisis, because we face our own end, our own difficulties. And unless we change and evolve, we risk further pain and even, the end. That's why the eighth house, is death or resurrection. And it requires that work of consciousness and evolution, and it's basically a recharge. So if, the first sign ruled by Mars is Aries, that's the first house of ignition. When you reach the eighth house, you reach the end of your spark. That's when you end there. But if you are able to change, and if you're able to transform yourself and to connect with other people's resources, then you have a second chance, a second lease, a resurrection. So that's why these two houses are naturally working together, the beginning and the end, and the new beginning. So it's a second beginning, it's a second Mars jumpstart, eighth house. And so in the ninth house, that's when you realize, oh my God, now that I've jump-started and that I've changed and evolved, there's so much more to life. And I reach that, that expansion, that realization. I find deeper meaning to my life. So the third quadrant from 7, 8, and 9th houses are where we are hungry and we need to outgrow our own selves. So it's a house where we feel a lot of this is a whole quadrant where we feel a lot of lack, and we feel we go through a lot of ups and downs, a feeling of depletion, and then a feeling of resurrection and expansion, and then again depletion and expansion. So it's where a lot of drama happens. It's in those three houses. Then we reach the last quadrant, and that's a very critical point when we cross the MC and meet the last three houses, because you can realize that from Aries to Sagittarius, from the 1st to the 9th, you are in charge of your destiny. You did your own thing up to the 6th house, and then you got help and a boost through the 7, 8, 9th houses. And you reach your maximum potential there in Sagittarius 9th house. It's that ego boost, it's that growth, that expansion of self. But then you reach that MC and you reach the point of Saturn. And here everything changes. And you enter a completely different rhythm and paradigm. And so you see that each quadrant is basically representing a radical shift. So the shift between the 9th and the 10th is that the 9th, you call the shots. You lead your own destiny. It's fire to fire. So it's up to you. The stronger you are, the farther you go. But when you reach Saturn in the 10th house, that's when you realize it's not up to you, that there is a higher order, that there is a higher reality that came before you, and that you need to align yourself, that it's, there are greater forces at play that have the last word, so to speak. So that's why the last quadrant doesn't have any fire, because there's no self. Fire is about the self. There's no self really in that last quadrant. And you move from Capricorn, that alignment, to a higher order. Now remember that the spiritual meaning of Saturn is also karma and accountability. I'm going to teach a workshop about that this weekend. If you're interested, check my website. The recording is also available. But it's a very deep archetype, because we know Saturn can be a pain, but the reason why Saturn is so unpopular is because we suddenly are not the ones making the decisions. Even though, we are on top of the chart there, we actually have to be accountable. We have to respond to a higher order that's beyond the ego. So the ego is basically remembering or realizing it's part of a larger whole. And so it goes from the 10th to the 11th house, where we meet our community, where we expand, that alignment to the greater development of civilization and society. And so there's another interesting point that happened, another threshold that happened at the end of that Aquarius, from Aries to Aquarius, from 1 to 11, is that even though we move, from fire here to the 10th house of authority, accountability, being a role model, responding to higher standards, the 11th house has to do with our collective creativity. If the 5th house is our individual creativity and what we want to give and produce and deliver, the 11th house is about how we as a whole, as a group, as a civilization, how do we advance life? How do we promote better conditions? That's why Aquarius, is also a sign of the genius and the sign of progress and breakthroughs and higher awareness. But it has to do also with merging our brains and working as a community to make things hopefully better. And then we reach that maximum in Aquarius. It's that place of higher frequency, spiritual development, breakthroughs, higher realizations. But it's also a point where we realize, as we move into the future, Aquarius relates to science. It relates to higher knowledge. It's a higher octave of Mercury. We suddenly also meet a threshold, and that threshold is where we suddenly enter the 12th house, and the 12th house represents something that is completely different. It works with completely different rules. That's why astrologers tend to often misdiagnose the 12th house, or not know how to deal with it. What is it? It's the unconscious, it's self-undoing, it's spirituality. It's all kind of a mix of weird associations. But the reality is that the 12th house is a portal to something that is outside our ego. But it's so far outside that we don't always know how to manage it. Now, a quick way, to understand this paradigm, look at it that way. I use Virgo and Pisces, which you can also relate to 6th house, 12th house. So through the 6th house, you are in control. You fix, you plan, you work. And through the 12th house, it's not up to you. It's larger than you. It's not your responsibility. It represents all the forces in life that came way before you existed. Some may call it God, and here represented in a very patriarchal way, but just, just capturing the symbolism. So it really represents what we are, what is beyond us. And it's a very humbling place to be, because it's where we don't know. It's where we cannot predict things. And that's where we can be in a place of confusion. But the reality is that there's a purpose. It's there for good reasons, and it's part of our evolutionary package. So going back to the sequence, when we come to the 12th house, we basically meet the end of the self. And that can be something that, is traumatizing, but it can also be something that's humbling. And if you work well with your 12th house, you can also make it one of the most successful experience, deepest experience. So what does that mean, make it work? We live in a culture, Western culture, where control is our priority. Now, we live in the coronavirus pandemic. Neptune is in the sign of Pisces. And we're facing circumstances that take the control away. And we're suddenly panicking and are at great risk of getting sick. So that's very much a 12th house experience where, the Virgo cannot fix it. There's no immediate solution. We're kind of in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight. And that's part of that dichotomy between the 6 and the 12. Like I said, the 6 is what is up to me. The 12 is what is not up to me. So when we reach that last quadrant, we start more and more getting into that realm, deeper into that realm of the unknown, of what is beyond us. And it's a twilight zone because we don't have our clear references, and our own mind does not have all the answers. So we need to rely on other senses and other faculties to make it work. So that's why, you can see in many traditional texts that the 12th house is about self-undoing. It's about prisons and, all kinds of really scary stuff. Because, what happens in a prison, your control is taken from you. Your autonomy is taken from you. You are at the mercy of a larger force. And that, in that case, is the government. That's why Saturn in the 12th house, is a classic signature for incarceration, because the Saturn is the government, it's the structure in some aspects. So in the 12th house, you can experience that loss of control as a result of whatever planet is there. But like I said, it doesn't have to be only that chaos and loss of self in a negative sense. So now we go back to, if we enter that twilight zone, we need to go back to understanding the first house. What is that 12th house? How does it respond, and how does it lead to the first? Because after the 12th comes the first. And the first is that ignition of self. So in the 12th house, we return to connect with the forces that are larger than us. Now, what are these forces? I'm going to go back here. Forces that are beyond your control. These can be higher spiritual forces, the forces of creation. And that's where fate happens. We have that whole discussion between fate and free will. Well, free will is Mars. It's what comes after. You make your decisions. Fate, where things are not up to you and where there's a greater sense of destiny beyond your control, is in that 12th house. But forces are larger than you are also forces of nature. Look at, where is it? Sorry about that. Look at this slide. On the left side, you have the Uranus, modernity, advancement, breakthroughs, technology, science, life as we lead it. And we're so proud of ourselves because we develop our civilization. And everything is more advanced, and we have airplanes and rockets going into space, and we feel that we are becoming ourselves gods. But then what happens the moment we leave? The moment no one's there to clean up the floor or to work. Nature reclaims everything. Think about what's going on now. In the world, everyone is quarantined, or most of us. And, industry is at a standstill. And we see that nature is suddenly responding. Less pollution, cleaner air, animals, feeling more confident to roam around, So we see this suddenly, that when humans retreat, the larger forces, nature itself, reclaim its territory. So we realize that the moment we're gone, who's gonna really be here? Nature. And we are part of nature. Problem is, from a Mars point of view, is that we forget that we're part of nature. We forget that we're part of the 12th house. So this is, a visual illustration of that. And if you take a Virgo and you take them to that picture, the Neptune picture and the 12th house picture, they will freak out because it's not clean and it's full of potential creepy crawlers, and it's not sanitized, and it's it's overwhelming. The jungle is dangerous. The deserts are dangerous. The sea floors are not hospitable places for humans. But these are all the Neptunian places where humans are not really commanding or in their dominion. And so it can be intimidating. Going back to our, this is another example of sixth house. I'm in control. And so I tame nature. I make sure it's manicured and it's safe, and there are no weeds and so forth. And the 12th house and Pisces is the way it was before we started to intervene and change. Now, you're going to ask, so what is better? And some people will say, well, of course nature is better, and of course the jungle is more healthier and whatnot. But the truth is, none of us live on a tree house, and we are safer in a cleaner environment. Most of us don't live out on a tree. So we need the Virgo. We need to work with nature. We need to chop wood and create shelter and grow vegetables and clear the jungle to create a garden and whatnot. So that is that dichotomy. And today, as Neptune is in the sign of Pisces, it's even felt more intensely, because we realize that we have over-controlled everything, over-manicured, that we are, depleting our natural resources, that nature is suffering, is on the verge of a collapse. Whether it's the climate that's going crazy, whether it's deforestation, whether it's the extinction of species. Like Neptune in Pisces creates a form of bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy is in the natural world. So what happens? Nature fights back. And we see a growth through Neptune in Pisces, an intensification of natural events. The hurricanes are ever more aggressive and more frequent. And the droughts and the floods are ever more intense and frequent. And all this is basically a message between, the forces we control, and then remembering the forces we cannot control. And of course, this virus, who presumably emerged from the abuse of nature, abuse of wildlife, where Chinese practices of decimating natural resources and basically emptying Africa of its wildlife to, for its wild markets and medicine and whatnot. The pangolin, which is an animal that is supposed to be one of the carrier of the disease, is at 6%, its original number, from the 70s. And so that's how far we've gone. And so you see this picture where now the jungle, the forces of nature, the larger forces, are trying to reclaim dominion. And what are we forced to do? We're forced to stay home, and we can't produce, and we cannot, be out. And who's happy about it? The trees are happy. The animals are happy. Nature is happy. And so because of that absence of balance, we've reached a point where we see ourselves separate from nature. So part of the healing, if we go back to this natural wheel, is to understand that as we move forward in our lives, we need to remember where we're coming from. You know, now the 12th house, I said, is the end of self. It's the place where there's no ego. And that's why it can be intimidating. Because when you're not in control, you don't feel safe. But it's also where the forces of creation are operating, and that's where we meet these greater forces. That's where we meet our own origin. And so this is where we're basically connected to our deeper, more spiritual identity. So it's the fusion of the separate self with everything before separation. Now, let me ask you, what separates us? I'm here, Maurice Fernandez. I'm talking about the 12th house. You are in Australia or wherever you are on the globe. What separates us? What separates everything? That's an open question. Let's see if anyone has a clue.
Maurice, one response from Aaron is, he says, the illusion of self.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I see another one. Is there another comment?
Yes, conscious awareness.
Okay, conscious awareness is separating us.
Another one, we are humans, not gods. We are on earth to learn and find our authentic selves.
Yes. So these are very important points and all touch on, you know, an important phase of that. First of all, the illusion of self. In a way, it is and it isn't, because from a 12th house point of view, separation is an illusion. And so the self is an illusion. But from a first house to 9th house, or from a fire element point of view, you know, the Aries and the Leo and the Sagittarius, it's not an illusion. I am here and you are there. I am 5'7", you are 6'2". I don't know. I mean, there is a visible separation. So is that an illusion? Maybe, maybe not. I know I can feel it. I can feel that I'm aging. I can feel that I'm changing. Consciousness. When I spoke of the Aries principle, I spoke about the ignition. And what is that ignition? It's the ignition of our consciousness. So in a way, as we develop ourselves and expand our consciousness, you know, we are growing into, you know, our individual selves, our authentic selves. So there's definitely a connection there between separate consciousness, our own consciousness, and the divine and everything else. But one of the things that separates us, you know, very practically, is time and space. You know, space, you are over there, I'm over here. Even look at your astrology. you know, you're a Libra and you're a Virgo and you're a Leo and you're whatnot. What separates us? We're all born in a different time, in a different place, so we each have a different chart. And that's part of our individuality. But then Pisces will say, well, from a 12th house point of view, you may have a different chart, but you all have all the same planets and you all have all the same signs. You know, we're all made of the same ingredients. So are we really different? Or is that an illusion? And we can argue forever, you know, whether it's the chicken or the egg, whether we are all one or whether we are individuals. But the truth is, we're both. We are both separate and we're both unified simultaneously. That's why these two signs hug the ascendant, which is the starting point, the oneness and the one. But what is the difference is that the 12th house operates outside of time and space. And it's the only house that does that. When you're in prison, do you have a concept of time? You lose the concept of time. But when you are in nature and you become one, you're also losing a concept of time. So time separates us. Right now, I'm giving a lecture. After that, I have a reading. After that, I'm going to have dinner. After that, I'm going to sleep. So each moment has a different activity, and they're all separated by time. So if we remove time and space, you are everything, everywhere, always, with everyone. Everything is happening simultaneously as one. And that's something we can spiritually connect with, but it's not easy to bring that into our physical, material world, because matter is a function of separation in time and space. However, as I said, both exist at the same time. We live in two dimensions simultaneously. And we can argue which one is real. I say both are real. Both are necessary. Both have a purpose. However, we're not taught at school about the other dimension. We're only taught about time and space. And so, you know, it's hard for us to find a vocabulary or to tap into timelessness if we're not, you know, naturally, instinctively going there. But that's part of the reason the 12th house is so weird, because it operates on different physical laws, on different paradigms. Now, I'm saying, you know, that's where, that's the end of a cycle. So what actually happens in the 12th house after you've done everything? You've accomplished and created and built and evolved. You reach that climax in the 11th house where, you know, you're flying into space and you're finding cure for diseases, and you're on top of your game. Uranus represents the genius, the highest frequency, your highest expression, your highest self. And then you come into the 12th house, and the message is, well, guess what? It doesn't belong to you. Your house, it doesn't belong to you. Your children, they don't belong to you. your profession and your skills, they don't belong to you. And so in the 12th house, that's where you relinquish everything and you release it back to nature, back to the public, back to the collective, back to the oneness. So that's why whatever you have in the 12th house is actually something you can give to many, many people beyond the boundaries of time and space. And that's why the 12th house, as a mirror to the 6th house, is the house of service, and it's equally a profession-oriented house. Sounds very strange, but you can test that. That's true for the placement of Neptune, planets in Pisces, or planets in the 12th house relate to any kind of service that we need to offer as a gift to the world. Now, when I say as a gift, it doesn't mean that you're not paid for it, but it means that you have access to touch the masses, to touch larger groups of people. And you will see many people who live a very public life will have a very loaded 12th house. And all of us have Neptune somewhere, have something in our 12th house, whether it's a sign or a planet. And it's a channel through which we can connect to that oneness, which means we can connect to everything. And that's also where we realize that we don't own anything, and yet we own everything. Just the same way that we are nothing, but we are everything. I hope I'm making sense. But I'm going to give you some examples so you can better understand this. So the 12th house, I would say a professional axis is the 6th and 12th. So what's the difference between the 6th and the 12th? The 6th house is how you logistically create your work. You know, you have your software and you have your tables and you analyze your chart and you create and you assemble all the resources you have to provide a service. But the 12th house is actually who's going to come and want your service. Once you open shop, once the doors open, who's going to respond to your service? You can't just go out and tell people, hey, have a reading, or buy my shoes, or buy my art. No. You've done your work. Now, the public, the indiscriminate world will respond to what you've done. And then we see if it's appealing, necessary, or not. So in the 12th house, you're not just forming a relationship with forces larger than yourself, such as God, such as nature, or such as anything that may be stronger than you, but it can also be the place where you connect to the collective pool, to the everythingness, and where you can basically reach people. This is, these are things that are more clearly described in my book on Neptune. So if you need, to review that and see how it applies with every sign, by all means, read that. Now, that's how you culminate, is that you've worked hard from house 1 to house 11. And in the 12th house is when you give it back. It's not just giving back your body and ashes to ashes. It's also when you're giving back your service or the labor of your incarnation, whether it's a service that you get paid for or whether it's who you are as an individual. But then in the 12th house is also the beginning of your new cycle. If the first house is your birth, the 12th house is the pregnancy before your birth. That's why I refer the 12th house to the cosmic womb. And remember, what is in a womb? Just like a baby, you're not in control. Your parents feed you and take care of you. And you're just passively sitting in water. Think about that, not just mother to child, but you and the universe. You're in the cosmic, the universal womb. And so what the experience is in the 12th house is that everything is provided. You have enough water falling from the sky and trees full of nutrients and fruits and vegetables. And you have oxygen that's provided. And you have light from the sun and heat. So through the 12th house is like the beginning of everything before time, when all is, and it's there for you because you are all. And that's why the 12th house is the house where you can feel that something, God, the elements, nature, takes care of you. So the same way someone is incarcerated and they're fed and they're provided a roof and they don't do anything. And that's the negative mirror of that. But in a positive way, it's like being in paradise, where you are just surrendering and you just are, and everything else is happening. So that's why there's a lot of naivety and purity in that 12th house and in Neptune, because there's trust in something that takes care of you. And that something is knowing that the sun will rise tomorrow. Whether you will wake up or not, the sun will be there. And so forth. And that's why in the 12th house, if you look at ancient traditions and indigenous tradition, there's a lot of ritual involved in invoking the gods and the god of rain when you need rain, because it's not up to you. You need to connect with these larger forces in order to feel sheltered and to feel that life is a good thing. But if you feel that you don't like it here, you don't like the rain, you don't like the heat, you don't like your fate, then the 12th house becomes a big struggle, because it can reflect that fear, that resistance to even incarnate. Like, why am I here? I don't want to be here. But what is the lesson of the 12th house? Is that if you accept life, you accept the whole package, not just the parts that you like. It's both the beauty and the challenge, and that involves even suffering. So through that 12th house, you're back in the womb and you feel sheltered by the sky. And then a new process of birth. You need to get out of the womb through the first house and continue your journey of incarnation. And, we can talk a lot longer about that, but I just want to give you some examples so this makes more sense. Now, you will see in the book some elements. You see stages of development where you are in the innocence in the 12th house, and then you lose your innocence and you need to strengthen your immunity. Then there's a public function, and that's where I was talking about the 12th house being a place where you can reach the masses, where you can connect to the oneness and so forth. And following phases of defying fear, humbling the ego, and spiritual awareness. So one person may experience the 12th house as a loss of innocence, whereas another one may experience it as a spiritual awareness. We may have the same planet there, but we are in a different level of expression. That's again, birth versus ascension. So the triangle down is incarnation, and the triangle up is about reconnecting to the source. Now, you will see some people, spiritual leaders, who are constantly pushing to the triangle up. And they can be very spiritual, but then they're not grounded. And there can be a split between spirit and flesh. And that's when you have all these very wise gurus that end up abusing their followers because there's a split in them and they don't practice what they preach. So we need both the lower triangle as much as we need the ascension. What's in the middle? The heart. Heart opens when you are simultaneously integrated into your separate identity and your universal oneness. The oneness and the one are connected at the heart. That's the middle of those triangles. So that's how it can feel sometimes, with the 12th house, that you're a little dot and the elements are much larger than you. But you can either drown or you can ride the wave. That's what surfers do. And so the wave takes you places if you allow it to. But if you fight the wave, it's a lost battle. So the 12th house, the forces beyond our control, what we learn to accept, whether we accept willingly or whether we're compelled to accept it. So it's our ego, it's a loss of the ego, but it's also, and that can lead to humility, or it can lead to being a doormat. It can lead to having no ambition. You can sometimes ask some 12th house people what they want, and they're going to say, I don't know. I never thought about it. It can dull you. But it can also, in a positive way, not dull you, but make you humble. What cannot be owned and what must be shared with everyone. Like I said, you don't even own your children. You think you do because you created them, but actually you release them to life. You don't own your land, and so forth. And then the professional ability to touch the masses. So in the miracle phase is where we are all one and there's no separation. So the lion is the fawn or the lamb. But then when you lose innocence and you realize you do need to take care of your separation, you realize you cannot trust everything out there. There are dangers. That's where people can feel victimized in the 12th house, because they remember that and they say, what's the problem? That's the problem. This is as real as that is real. You know, some people will say you're a fairy, you believe in fantasy, but I'm going to say no, I'm not. We are all one, and I am the predator and the prey. But I also am in a separate material world, and I need to know that there's danger, and this is for evolutionary reasons. That's what messes up our mind. You know, we are either here or here without understanding that we're actually in both places. And so in the 12th house, you know, you can deny suffering and pain. It's all good, it's all fine. The sky takes care of us, and you don't realize you're bleeding. Yeah. And so, you know, there's something about the apocalypse, a very apocalyptic 12th house, because it represents the end of time and the end of a cycle. And we feel that with Neptune in the 12th house, like, are we going to make it? Are we actually going to be able to swim to shore? Or are we losing control completely? And the truth is, this is a big lesson about reconnecting with the deeper principles of life and rebalancing ourselves. So some people with strong 12th house, you know, Richard Branson, super successful with a Sun and Mercury in the 12th house. And guess what? He has an airline company, and he's very involved with show business. And so you see that there's no undoing here. He's pretty much on top of his game, but he's in tune, and so he can create things. And Madonna, you know, packed 12th house, including a Sun in Leo. If she would have gone to an astrologer, you know, that's always my point with this 12th house is, what would an astrologer tell her if she was a teenager, telling them, I want to be famous? They would have told her, guess what? You need to be behind the scenes and you're going to end up in jail. But guess what? What she was tapping into with her Leo Sun in the 12th house is that she knew she had something that had appeal on a collective level. And that's, you know, that was a driving force. And with the Sun in Leo, which is very strong ego, it's like you give your ego to the masses. Leonard Cohen, you know, same thing, an ascendant Sun in the 12th with Neptune. And Venus Neptune is so musical, you know, and he gives his music to the world. That's another time. This is a prostitute who was also a politician in Italy. So you see Venus conjunct Neptune in Libra in the 12th. And how do you see the prostitute? Is that she gives herself to everyone indiscriminately. So there's definitely a level of promiscuity in the 12th house, because I don't own my own body, you know, and I'm falling in love with everybody because we're all one. So there's no separation, which also means I can have sex with everything. So that's an illustration of that. Very idealistic, but also no protection. And then you have many public figures with packed 12 houses. And people with a Pac 12 house will often have very strong public lives, but very challenging personal lives. Because you don't own your own self in the 12th house. You have to give so much. You will see most politicians will have either Saturn or the Sun in the 12th, or Leo or Capricorn. So Biden, with the Sun, and Barack with Saturn, Jupiter, he was a lawyer. And you see, this is a list of public figure politicians with these signatures. George Bush, it's not related to any party. Vladimir Putin, Saturn, Sun, Neptune in the 12th. Public life, that's what he does. And so forth. And that's another example which I find interesting. Prince William is born with Neptune in the 12th on the ascendant, and he's born into public service. He was famous before he was even born. Like, people knew about him because he was royalty. And so you see that Neptune, that he's already born into a public role from age 0. And that opposes his Sun in Cancer, which so much, needs privacy and family and a personal life. So you see that conflict between the collective, the loss of self into this role and being a future king, versus, I want to spend time with my kids, Cancer, Sun. So I hope this gives you a starting point, some inspiration about exploring the 12th house and seeing different faces of it. If, maybe, I don't know if we have time for question. I went a bit over time.
We do have one question from Linda. Okay. And she is asking, what additional information is there in the second edition of your Neptune book versus the first edition?
Well, let's put it this way. It's double the size. So it's developed to much, much deeper levels. And it's a lot of new material. It feeds on, it's building on the same foundation as the first book, but it's written better because I polish my writing skills, but it's also much more material. And there's a whole section also on the transit of Neptune in Pisces, which was not there in the first book. So if you have the first book, you will enjoy the second edition. It's, it's like 10 steps ahead.
Thanks, Maurice. And a final question. What about when you have Neptune or Pisces in the first house, or Mars or Aries in the 12th? Would this be a balancing influence?
Well, these are the, very opposite archetypes, right? Because Mars is about separation and the 12th house is about unification and the relinquish of the self. So you can have, depending on those levels, if we go back to those levels, in a sense, Mars in the 12th can feel that they don't need to fight for anything, that everything's safe. They may not initially feel angry about anything. They don't know anger. They don't have a will of their own because what everybody else wants is what they want. So there can be some kind of naive trust and defenselessness, openness that is very pure, but also naive. And this can lead to people like that to end up, on the one hand, very positive, but then also bullied. because they don't have defenses and they don't know how to fight back. And if they are facing aggression, they can be overwhelmed. They can feel defeated. So you can have a lot of misplaced anger, not knowing how to fight back. And that's the loss of innocence. But then I recommend many people with this signature to actually learn to strengthen their immunity there, which means accept your incarnation, accept that life involves a battle, and don't refuse to be part of it. Even learning martial arts can be very therapeutic for Mars in the 12th. And what often happens with Mars in the 12th is that they can fight for other people, but they don't always know how to fight for themselves. And that's what they need to learn. Now, we know in evolutionary astrology that you're always learning from the polarity. And the polarity of the 12th house is the 6th house. So what do you do with your Mars? You need to ground it. You need to develop your sense of purpose, your will, your instinct to protect yourself. And then you learn to connect your separate, you need to find your will and then bring it to a greater good. So instead of starting without a will and feeling that you don't exist, because that's what Mars in the 12th can feel, is that somebody deleted them. They need to fight and reclaim their will and find themselves, and then give it willingly from a place of confidence to the larger whole.
Thank you. That was excellent. We do have 2 more questions, but it's up to you.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, fantastic. Any wisdom on Ceres in the 12th house?
That's a tough one. You know, I'm still exploring myself, the asteroids, and they're much more than, you know, what we often learn about. But Ceres, you know, the myth of Ceres, obviously the great mother of agriculture, but it's also representing the great famine. And you will see Ceres, for example, this year, right? As we started the Pluto-Saturn conjunction, that kind of was the trigger for a lot of the crisis we're into. Ceres was conjunct that Pluto-Saturn, and we see that, you know, it's a period of famine in a way, and retreat, and where there's, you know, the economy is suffering. So Ceres in the 12th house is about really connecting to a higher spiritual mother, but also realizing that we are, you know, that nature, if we respond to nature, we can adapt to its cycles of retreat and cycles of abundance without feeling victimized by it. You know, that's one direction I would take this.
Great. And the final question, would you happen to know why the angelic cherubs, example, eagle, bull, lion, man, are always in the fixed signs?
Yes, I've done a lot of work on that actually, and you know, I've explored that a lot, because it is the fusion of the fixed signs, which are the signs of creativity and transmutation. So you will see them in the Bible, you know, the first book of Ezekiel, where he has a vision of the bull and the eagle and the lion and the man. So the man is Aquarius, bull is Taurus, eagle is Scorpio, and the lion is Leo. So what are these symbols about? You know, it's another topic as we're getting out of the 12th house, but think about the fact that the fixed signs and the fixed archetype relate to kingdom, to our own dominion. So the fixed signs relate to our contribution, what we are here to do as individuals. And so what is that for? It is to serve the creation. In a way, this is the fixed axis, the fixed cross is the cross of giving. Whereas the mutable cross is the cross of receiving. Because through the mutable cross, the Pisces and the Gemini and the Virgo, we are in a state of receptivity. You know, we are at the mercy of what's larger than us. Whereas the fixed signs is what we are giving and delivering. So this has to do with our, you know, the purpose of our incarnation, if you will.
Okay, thank you so much, Maurice. Okay, we're winding down now. Would you like to leave us with some final thoughts?
Well, you know, the final thought would be to really contemplate the transit of Neptune in Pisces that captures, you know, a lot of this, what this energy is about, what the 12th house is about, and how this started as, you know, as a crisis with nature, and when we became increasingly aware of the depletion of resources, and how this also led to a movement of people wanting to reconnect and spiritualize their lives. So as we go through these dramas and, you know, face existential crisis, just, you know, what I would say is let's stop and listen.
Excellent, thank you so much. And now I'm unmuting everyone. Please tell us what you thought of Maurice's meeting, and would you also please thank Maurice Fernandez, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Maurice. Thanks, Maurice.
It's a very Neptunian active sound.